I started this business in 1990. Based on research I did at an organization called the Chamber of Mines of South Africa Research Organization. This was an organization that was primarily funded by the gold mining industry at the time. They employed about 600 researchers in mainly technical disciplines, looking at disciplines like rock mechanics and ventilation and explosive science. It was quite a prestigious research outfit, but they sort of ran out of funding towards the end of the 80s, primarily because the gold mining industry was on a very long decline. And in fact, the South African gold mining industry is just about dead now. Anyhow, there was a lab in this organization, believe it or not, they actually called it this. They called it the Human Resources Laboratory. You can imagine what we did to people there in 1982 in South Africa, never mind. And each one of these labs had a charter, and what was meant by a charter was a single line description of the scope of work of the lab. And the charter of the Human Resources Laboratory was to investigate the human problem on mines. What a kind of a job description. Anyhow, it was not entirely inappropriate because it was the 80s, the country was going through a civil war, and in fact, most of the resistance against the state, the apartheid state, that was happening domestically was actually happening through the labor union movement, and the principal industry was the mine. So it was a very interesting time to kind of cut your teeth in the realm of conflict. Based on that work, there was a whole raft of content that got developed that looked at things such as leadership excellence, personal excellence, team excellence, and all of this content centers around the theme of intent. I left the Chamber of Mines at the end of 1989 and started this business, and we've done work throughout the world. I mean, quite literally from Japan to Panama. And we now have 4 operating offices. One based, the mothership is obviously still based in South Africa, but then we've got 2 other offices. One is based in Sweden, further is based in Pakistan, and then one that's developing through the auspices of Clinton and Hasnain in Melbourne, in Australia. And then, I mean, we have been going for 30 years. We've worked in just about every conceivable industry. I mean, you name it, and we've done.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I see 13 people, 13 participants.
Yeah.
But I'm only looking at 9. Have you perhaps got some people in the waiting room that you haven't let in? Okay.
I've got everybody.
Maybe
the waiting room is open. There's nobody in the waiting room. No.
All right, then they must be sitting with cameras and sound off. Thank you.
There are a few people that are sitting with cameras off. Okay. So, it's excellent. The kind of just this work that focuses on intent kind of is really concerned with trying to reframe how we view organizations in a way that would be appropriate to what we've been trying to do to leadership. I mean, what you probably are aware that, I mean, there's been a growing sort of raft of work around leadership starting from the mid-60s that was really concerned with a discomfort at sort of what could be referred to as command and control management styles. Been a greater and greater sort of emphasis on this idea of democratizing the workplace and democratizing work and democratizing the relationship between bosses and subordinates at work. Now, that's kind of fine, but the problem is that a lot of the stuff that has been done in this sort of growing discipline of leadership science, in fact, one of the things that's moved in this move from looking at democratizing leadership at work is that we increasingly refer to people who lead others at work as leaders rather than managers. And what hasn't occurred to us, though, is that you can't just change how you describe the leader if you don't change how you envisage the organization. Because it's appropriate to think, if you think of an organization as a machine or a system that produces a result or does work, then it's appropriate to call somebody who's in charge of that thing a manager, because that's what managers do. They make things work. Leaders lead communities. So in other words, you can't just change how you're framing your understanding of leadership without reframing your understanding of organizations. So there's a deeper problem that's at issue. We can't just shift from talking management to talking leadership if we don't change our way of looking at the organization from to achieve a result to a community of people who collaborate to serve. The reason why it's actually functional to shift how we view organizations from organizations to communities is that we then have access to the possibility of working with the intent of the individual. Because if you try and consider
well, I was finished, and then Clint, Clint reminded me that I'd said I hadn't spoken about, but all I have to do is just join it. Oh, he's just said thanks.
Hey, Sally, you're not on mute.
Okay, there you go. I've done that. Right. So where were we?
Our nickname for Sally is Techie Cell. Just that says it all.
Okay. So coming back to this idea, why do we need to reframe our understanding of an organization from a system that works to a community of people who collaborate to serve? It is precisely because at the door of service is where all excellence and certainly performance of organizations lie. Because businesses don't just exist to work. They actually exist in order to serve customers and clients. Even the smallest enterprises do. I mean, even a vegetable market in Southeast Asia, those people are there because they're providing things that are useful to others. Businesses don't exist for themselves. They exist to serve. This is already apparent in the first rule of transaction, because the first rule of transaction is that supply exists to serve demand and not the other way around. And if you frame this idea of organizational success lying at the door of service and the intent to serve, the next thing one needs to understand is that cannot happen unless that translates into how individuals operate. Because in a sense, no organization has an intent. Individuals carry an intent. I mean, so if you really wanted to understand how this intent to serve translates into what actually happens, you need to kind of understand what that means for individuals. And in a sense, another way of thinking of that then is people in organizations are kind of distributed in a cone. I mean, you can think of an organization as a cone because there's fewer people at the top than at the bottom. And if you really wanted to kind of explore what this issue of intent means and the intent to serve means in the organization, the first thing you need to do is you need to understand what this means for peer groups, for teams. So you need to kind of, in a sense, do I beg your pardon. Before we get to the peer groups, this intent to serve, how we can argue that actually accounts for the fundamental success of an organization is borne out by a little metaphor that we operate. We call it the three bakers analogy. And the three bakers analogy basically said, assume you've got three bakers who bake a cake. It's a very difficult cake to bake. It takes them a whole month to bake a cake. And at the end of the month, the cake is sold and each baker takes a slice home. The question is, if that's the case, what's the slice that's left? And we will call the slice that's left, if you're a capitalist, you'd call it a profit. If you're a socialist, you call it a surplus. But it actually doesn't matter whether you're talking about a capitalist company or a socialist cooperative. We would measure the success of the organization based on the size of that slice, of the surplus. And the question is, why does that slice exist? I mean, surely that slice only exists because the total cake that was baked was bigger than what each individual took home. In other words, collectively, have these people given more than what they've taken, or have they taken more than what they've given? And clearly, they've given more than what they've taken. In other words, that surplus is the direct measure of the degree to which the average person in the group gives more than what they take. So if you want to understand why the organization succeeds, well, the organization succeeds because at a granular level, individual by individual, each person is giving more than what they're taking. And that intent to give, that intent to make a discretionary contribution to the organization, in the first instance, is manifest in how people in peer groups treat each other. So if you took a horizontal section through this cone, you'd be dealing with a team or a peer group. And how that team succeeds and why that team succeeds becomes apparent when you think about the success of a sports team, like a soccer team. I mean, surely in any soccer team, a successful professional soccer team, most of the work that happens on the field is not about somebody scoring. It's about somebody trying to set somebody else up to score. In other words, this suggests a kind of magnanimity by the person who's setting their colleague up to score. They're saying to the colleague, you know, I'm quite happy for you to be the star. I don't just want to be the star myself. So when you have this element in a team where people are there to make each other the stars, you've basically got a healthy team. You've got a collaborative team that then produces a surplus. So this intent to serve in the first instance translates into how people deal with each other in the organization. Because you can think about the organization almost as a moving target of interactions between individuals over a period of time. And each one of those points of interaction between two individuals can fundamentally have one of two characters. It can either be fundamentally competitive or it can be fundamentally collaborative. They're fundamentally competitive when both of those people come into the engagement to get something out of the other person or to win or come first. It only becomes collaborative when at least one of the people in that interaction comes into the interaction deliberately to set their colleague up to succeed. So it's this intent to set my colleague up to succeed. That is what accounts for successful groups and successful teams. And in my experience, there's kind of three reasons that account for this possibility that people can have to be there to set their colleague up to succeed. And they are in ascending order. The first reason for this is cultural. So what I mean by that is that there's certain cultures in the world that just seem better at developing a collaborative mindset than others. And this is one of the reasons why I'm fascinated with the Swedes. I've married one. I'm so fascinated with this part of the world. I mean, they really are fascinating people. And if you consider, just off the top of your head, famous Swedish brands, it's a long list, Ericsson and SKF, Saab, aircraft, Bofors, which is a Saab subsidiary, artillery pieces. Saab also produces submarines, Volvo, Scania, Alfa Laval, Atlas Copco, mining equipment, H&M, apparel, Spotify. I mean, there's not an industry where these people haven't made the most extraordinary contribution. How many people are there in this country? There's only 10 million people here. I mean, that's quite shocking. There's half the number of people in this entire country as what there are in the city that I live in. This amazingly tiny population have made this extraordinary contribution to the world. Why? Because if there's anything the Swedes do understand, that is collaboration. They even do sport in a collaborative way. I mean, they've got this thing called mothung, which basically means to do sport in order to participate and to help other people to participate. And this is the main reason why they do sport. They don't do sport to win. It's the most bizarre thing. As a South African, I find it beggars my imagination. Things that would be completely reasonable to do in a South African corporate context, like, for instance, make damn sure you got the last word. And if that means, you have to dirk the guy next to you in the management meeting or humiliate the woman on the other side of the table, that's fine, as long as your argument wins. In this part of the world, that just doesn't float. I mean, they won't talk to you at the water cooler afterwards. So if you're trying to account for this possibility of people being there to make an unconditional contribution to the organization, then you cannot dismiss this cultural variable. It's definitely a key aspect of the problem. The second reason why people will go the extra mile is that the group has what we would call a benevolent intent. And we'll do a few thought experiments in this hour, but this is one of them. What we mean by benevolent intent is that the intent of the organization is worth going the extra mile for. So let's say you work for GlaxoSmithKline in a manufacturing facility in Derby in the United Kingdom, and I'm your boss. And I came to you one day and I said, listen, please work very hard at making these drugs that we're manufacturing here, because if you do, you'll help to make a shareholder on the London Stock Exchange shamefully rich. I mean, if that's what I said to you, how would you feel about this? If you're a South African, you'd probably be toying down the road, which is a dance you do just before you try to murder a manager. I mean, it's deeply insulting. But if I said to you, work very hard at making these drugs, because if you do, you'll help to save millions of lives throughout the world. I mean, how would you feel about this now? You'd feel a lot better. In other words, you can't expect people to make a discretionary contribution, to come to work, to go the extra mile, to put in more than what they're getting out, if you don't give them a reason which is noble enough, which is benign enough for them to do so. And that's what we mean by the benevolent intent of an organization. And every organization has it. We just need to articulate it, because every organization has customers and clients. However, the most profound reason for people to go the extra mile is really how the group is led. So, because actually, if you really want to understand the conditions under which people are going to kind of work because they want to rather than work because they have to, then don't ask yourself what is the organization that people work for because they want to. Ask yourself who's the boss they're going to work for because they want to. In other words, if you're trying to account for the issue of collaborativeness, you need to do a second cut. You need to do a vertical cut in the organization. You need to understand how hierarchy operates. And one of the things you need to do in investigating hierarchy is that you need to explore the assumptions that people in leadership positions have of the job that they're doing. In other words, what does being in charge actually mean? Whether you call being in charge being a manager or a leader, what does that mean? And we do this, by the way. I mean, we've asked over the years, literally thousands of people to describe what the word leadership means. What does the word leadership mean? And this is kind of what people would say. So this is a subset of material that I got from a few groups over the last couple of months. So an example of what people would say. This is, as an answer to the question, what does the word leadership mean? And in a sense, what's interesting about this content is that although there's a plethora of detail, you can actually find two core themes in the content. First of all, there's a theme that has to do with people. So example to others, servanthood, assuming serving people, setting people up to for success. So it's about other people. Connecting people. But then there's another theme, which is really about outcomes, setting a direction, creating a vision, pointing out a direction. So there's these two themes in this, and you can take these two themes and string them together in a sentence, which it actually is sort of already in it. It's directing people to achieving a result. And that's how most people see the word leadership. If you ask most people to define the word leadership, you can distill what they say to this core sentence. Leadership is about achieving a result through people. This is how most people view the word. The problem with that word is that it's fraught, because if you have that view of being in charge, you won't make big givers, you'll make takers. And the way to understand that is to do a little bit of a thought experiment. So let's assume you've got two people working for you. We're going to call the one Joe, and we're going to call the other one Fred. And what we need to assume about Joe and Fred is that about this interaction is that you're an old goat like myself. You've been around for a while. So you could feasibly refer to knowledge that you gained in a job that you did in 1980. And we assume you did that job in 1980 really well. And both Joe and Fred have to do the work that you did, the same job that you did in 1980. And you say to Fred, in 1980, I did what you have to do now, and what I did worked. Don't argue with me, Fred. Shut up, go do what I did. In Joe's case, you say to Joe, in 1980, I did what you have to do now, and what I did worked. It may be helpful to you, Joe. Take a look at it. If that's your approach to these two people, The question is who you're going to work for who's going to work for you because they have to, and who's going to work for you because they want to. And clearly, Fred's going to work for you because he has to, and Joe's going to work for you because he wants to. And if the question is, well, so what makes those two interactions different? You could say, well, in the Fred case, you're being kind of quite mean and autocratic and domineering. And in Joe's case, you're being far more democratic and approachable. And if I asked you why, I said, well, I mean, Joe can make a decision that Fred can't make. And all of this is true. But this distinction between, if you like, the autocracy and democracy of your approach doesn't cut deeply enough to really understand the difference between these two interactions. If you really want to understand the difference between these two interactions, you need to separate two variables in your mind. You need to separate means and ends. And you've got to put in those two categories either the person who's doing the job or the job that's being done. So if we examine the Fred interaction, if you said to Fred in 1980, I did what you have to do now, what I did worked, go and do what I did, what you're trying to achieve is you're trying to get the job done. And by definition, Fred, the person, is your means, your resource to get the job done. Now, if we examine the Joe interaction, if we assume that in the Joe interaction, you meant what you said, if you said to Joe in 1980, I did what you have to do now, what I did worked, it may be helpful to you to take a look at it. If you really meant that, I mean, could you have a different outcome from what you had in 1980? And yes, you could. In fact, the outcome could be a complete catastrophic disaster. So the issue is, what is your end in this? In fact, your end is not to get the job done. Your end is to teach Joe something. Your end is the person. And what gives you the opportunity to teach Joe something is the job that he's doing. In other words, under the surface, there's a very peculiar inversion of means and ends. In the Fred case, you're using Fred as the means to get the job done. In Joe's case, you're using the job as the means to teach Joe something. Now, that inversion of means and ends actually indicates that there's been a shift in your intent, because you interrogate the issue of intent by asking yourself, who's the beneficiary of the interaction? Now, who do you think Fred would experience as the beneficiary of the interaction? Clearly, Fred is going to expect you, the boss, as the beneficiary of the interaction. So Fred will think that you're there to take from him. Who's Joe going to experience as the beneficiary of the interaction? He's going to say, well, he is. He'll experience that you're there to give him something. Now, if we say that organizations succeed based on the degree to which the average person comes to work to make a discretionary contribution to the business, then you have to understand, folks, that people don't go the extra mile for takers. And if the boss has this view of his role, if the boss says leadership is about achieving a result through people, then which one of these two interactions does that statement capture best? The Fred interaction or the Joe interaction? And distressingly, it actually captures the Fred interaction, because this statement turns the person into a means, and the aim is the job and the result. So if you say leadership is about achieving a result through people, you are by definition there to take. Leaders who have that view of their role cannot cultivate people who come to work to go the extra mile. And then your legitimate question would be, well, so then how must we rephrase that content in such a way for it to fit the Joe interaction? And we need to do something quite disturbing to that content. We need to say something like, leadership is about achieving people through results. Now, some people at this point say, but that doesn't make sense at all. I mean, that doesn't even sound like English. I mean, that just is completely bizarre. Well, if this is the case, then let's ask ourselves, I mean, can one make sense out of that statement? And you can, if you think of it through the lenses of coaching, because this is exactly what a coach does in a team sport, like soccer, for example. I mean, let's assume, I mean, the first reason why this is a useful analogy is you get the same variables at work as what you have in any team sport. You've got a coach, you've got a team who play the game, you get the game that gets played, and then the result that goes up on the scoreboard. Now, just assume you were the member of a soccer team, and you got a new coach, and the coach that you never met the coach before. The first time he meets you, he says to you, looks you as a player in the eye and says, listen, folks, my job as the coach is to achieve a result. I'm going to use you, the players, as my resources to do that. If you looked into this guy's eyes and you thought he actually meant what he was saying, you would probably loosen his wheel nuts or pour strychnine in his tea. because of the arrogance. Surely that's not his job. What is his job? His job is to coach the player. Now, does that mean to say that he's got no interest in the game that's being played and no interest in the result? Well, of course he has an interest in the game and the result, because you can't coach the player if you don't know what's happening on the field and you don't know what's happening on the scoreboard. But it doesn't make those two things your job. It makes those two things your means to do your job. In other words, the coach doesn't use the player as his means to achieve a result. He uses the result as his means to coach the player, which means to say it's entirely feasible to define leadership as leadership being about achieving people through results. You have to understand this, folks. The product of a leader is the people who report into him. The product of a leader or her. The product of a leader is people. And the organization should be viewed as a gymnasium to help the leader cultivate extraordinary people. And this, by the way, in my experience, is pixie dust. You crack this code and things change. I've done it for 30 years. Whenever this penny has dropped in the consciousness of a leadership team, the moment they understand, listen, our job is not to achieve a result. That's what the team is there for. Our job is to cultivate an extraordinary team. And the business, this organization, is a gymnasium that helps us to cultivate extraordinary people. When the leadership of the organization have that view, that enterprise takes off. It flies. And while the leadership of the organization doesn't have that view, that enterprise is always kind of lurching from crisis to crisis. So if we say the job of the leader is to cultivate the subordinate, then the next question is, so what is that actually about? I mean, can we put some flesh to that sort of basic skeleton of an idea that the boss is there for the subordinate and not the other way around? And yes, you can. And we have done this. We've asked people throughout the world on an ongoing basis this very simple question. Describe the boss that you would work for because you wanted to. If you could construct an ideal boss, the sort of boss that you'd work for because you really wanted to, you know, what would the person do for you and what would be in the relationship? And what you have here is a reasonably typical list. This came from a group that I trained a few weeks ago. A reasonably typical list of the kind of describing the boss that people had worked for because they wanted to. Now, the first thing that about this list that, you know, when one first sees a list like this is that it's kind of distressing. It is, you know, I mean, what did these people fail to mention? I mean, you know, it's kind of, they expect me to be a saint. But what becomes apparent, though, when you examine the list is that, listen, there are synonyms in this list. And if there are synonyms in the list, it means you can reduce the list. And I think you can do quite a radical reduction to the list because there's actually only two themes in that list. If you put the list through a still and did the work on it to say, well, what's in there? First of all, there's a theme that's got a soft and a kind ring to it. Sort of caught in words like right intention, trustworthy, supportive, listening, available, approachable, makes time for me, prioritizes me, authentic, human, etc. I think a key word that holds that theme is the word care. Because what you're saying to the person is, listen, have a genuine interest in me. Don't just be in this relationship to get something out of me. Care about me. But then there's a harder theme. Like, for instance, if you work for somebody who's always honest, that person surely isn't always going to be nice. And then the question is, well, why do you want the boss to be honest with you? Well, if they're honest with me, I know where I stand and I can learn and I can grow. So this harder theme is all about growth. I mean, that's why you want the person to give you clarity of vision. That's why you want the person to trust you. If you say, trust me, you're saying, treat me like an adult. Don't treat me like a child. Give me some authority here. In other words, if you distill this list of the boss that you'd work for because you wanted to, there's only two themes in the list, care and growth. And what's interesting about those two themes is that they are absolutely universal. They're true for every human being on the planet. We really have demonstrated this throughout the world in every conceivable industry. In fact, they're still to be contradicted. I mean, I've even found these criteria operative in the Pakistan army. Now, if these criteria are so universal, we need to account for that universality. And in order to do that, I would like to just investigate what this statement implies or what this word, this phrase implies. I mean, if you work for somebody because you want to, so let's assume you work for somebody because you want to, And so by definition, it's a person who does all of this stuff for you. It's a person who cares for you and grows you. And this person comes to you one day and asks you to do something. What would you do? You do it. In other words, I beg your pardon, you give this person the right to ask you to do things or to exercise power over you, which suggests that these criteria of care and growth are the core criteria for legitimate power. And when you see it from that point of view, the universality makes absolute sense. You know, the first relationship of power you had with another person in your life is with your parents. And this has to be significant because we have an intuitive understanding that there's a connection between the idea of first and the idea of principle. In other words, if you want to examine or understand the principle of a matter, examine the first manifestation of the matter. Now, the first manifestation of power is parenting. And in that relationship, there are two people. There's a big one, there's a parent, and there's a little one. And what's the job of the big one for the little one? It's very simple. The big one is there to care for and grow the little one. In other words, we can tease a principle out of this that says that any relationship of power is legitimate if the aim of that relationship is the care and growth of the subordinate. In other words, you can pay people 4 times what you're paying them now at work, and they're still going to come to work to try and get as much out of the organization as they can for giving as little as possible. If you want to change that, it's not about how much you pay them, it's actually who you are and how you deal with them. You know, until people experience that they work for bosses who are there to care for them and grow them, they will only come to work to get as much as they can. And this principle is true wherever you find hierarchy, by the way. This accounts for sort of satisfaction in the relationship of subordinates to bosses, subordinates to officers in the military organization, athletes to coaches. Wherever you find hierarchy, the subordinate will only consider that the big one is legitimately there. The subordinate will only commit to the leader if the subordinate feels that the leader is there to care for them and grow them. Now, this shift in intent of the leader to be there to give to the subordinate, to care for and grow the subordinate, is not necessarily synchronous with this idea of democratizing the workplace. Because if we go back to both kind of metaphors that we're now using as a baseline, the parenting metaphor and the coaching metaphor, it is clear that in both cases there's room for some direction, for some autocratic control. I mean, as an extremity, if you had a 9-month-old child who was learning to walk and the child kept on falling and hurting themselves, I mean, you would go over and you would take the child's hand. And you know, what's your intent in taking the hand is not to dominate the child, as you're trying to be helpful to the child. The child is the beneficiary of the hand. But now, isn't this hand also an autocratic imposition of control? And yes, it is. I mean, you know, so in other words, it's entirely feasible to autocratically impose control in the interest of the person you're doing this to. So the question then is, well, is it appropriate to just keep on controlling people? And clearly it isn't, because the aim is the growth of people. But, you know, if you're trying to grow the child, you wouldn't let go of his hand and then go stand on the other side of the room. Because if you're trying to create the condition where the child is capable, then you would take an incremental step back, because that's how growth works. Growth is an incremental process, which suggests that if you're trying to empower somebody, if you're trying to grow somebody, this requires an incremental suspension of control and not an absolute suspension of control. So this idea of legitimacy is not necessarily entirely synchronous with the idea of shifting the kind of the culture of the organization from a command and control to a democratic one, because that refers to something else, which is the spirit of the matter, which is that in every relationship of authority, there's an incremental handing over of decisions from boss to subordinate. Now, in each increment, there's a logically sound, or there's a rather intuitively sound logic that you have to respect. You know, you've come across the phrase, you know, don't give somebody a fish. I mean, you know, teach them to fish or empower them to fish. And if you wanted to empower somebody to fish, I mean, you know, what would you give that person? And clearly, you'd have to give them some stuff. I mean, you'd have to give them a hook, a line, a sinker, and so, if it's an Australian, probably some beer. If it's South African, some brandy. Maybe also, if it's certain parts of the world, possibly even some explosives. But you'd have to give him stuff. Further to that, you'd have to teach the person how to use this stuff. So you'd have to give him, tell him how to bait a hook, where to cast, why you should fish, all of the stuff. You just need to give the person the skill and the competency to do it. So if you want to ask oneself, well, what's the difference between these two categories? Then clearly the first category, it's almost like a hardware-software distinction. This first category is about stuff. You can call it means, the hook, the line, and the sinker, it's the stuff. The second category is really about the skill and the competency to be able to do this. So you can call that ability. And in my experience, folks, this is about as kind of comprehensive as people get when they think through the problem of empowerment. They think, well, you can't, clearly if you're trying to empower somebody, you can't just teach them stuff. You've also got to give them some means. But then they stop them. What they don't recognize, in fact, that this isn't adequate, you see, because let's assume you're dealing with me. And, I'm a very lazy person, and you're trying to empower me to fish. So you give me all the means I could conceivably require to fish. You give me all the ability I could conceivably require to fish. But because you're a really nice person, you've also got a freezer full of fish at home. And you say to me, don't worry, if you don't catch a fish, I'll give you one from my freezer. I mean, if that's your approach, how willingly do you think I'm going to fish? And actually, I'm not going to fish willingly at all. So what's the last thing you've got to bring to the party? It's almost like a bloody mindedness. You've got to say to me, look, if you don't catch a fish after this, starve. And that's called accountability. In other words, empowering people, folks, means three things and not just two. It means to give people the means to do what's required of them, to make them able to do what's required of them, and to hold them accountable. And if you don't do all three of these things, you do not empower people. You actually disable them. And consistent with the issue of means would be things like giving people the tools and the resources and the authority, the standard stuff. You can obviously think that authority is important. I repeated it twice there. If ability means to teach people how to do the job and why they should do it. Now, this issue of accountability, you see, accountability doesn't make sense outside of the idea of standards. You can't hold somebody accountable if there isn't a clear standard for what's required of them, which kind of suggests that somebody's performance can either be above standard or it can be below standard. Somebody's performance can be below standard. I beg your pardon. Somebody's performance can be above standard in one of two ways. They're either going the extra mile or they're careful to do what's required of them. And the appropriate thing to do with somebody who's gone the extra mile is clearly to reward them, and somebody who's careful is to recognize them. And when somebody's performance is below standard, first of all, if they're deliberately malevolent, and this does happen, by the way, person steals or whatever, then the appropriate thing to do is to dismiss them. And if they're careless, the appropriate thing to do is to warn them. And that kind of suggests that there's a dividing line here, because this little instrument sets itself up sort of in a means and ends sense. So in a sense, you can't hold somebody accountable. It's unfair to hold somebody accountable if you haven't given them the means or the ability to do what's required of them, which suggests that in this process of empowering people, you can make one of two mistakes. And we call these two mistakes the difference between the soft and the hard mistake. So the hard mistake really is concerned with treating means and ability issues as if they are accountability issues. So, and that's why we call it the hard mistake, because it's sort of too harsh. Let's assume you give me all the means I could require to do the job. You give me all the ability I could require to do the job. I beg your pardon. It's the opposite. You don't give me the means. You don't make me able. I don't know how to do this. My performance is below standard. And you then dismiss me. I mean, that's just too harsh. That's the hard mistake. The soft mistake, however, has exactly the inverse phrasing. It's to treat accountability issues as if they are means and ability issues. So this is what I should have said before. I mean, so let's assume the person has the means to do the job. They're completely able to do the job. Their performance is below standard, and you send them on another course, or you train them, or you maybe, I've even seen people say this, I'm gonna give them, reduce their authority a little bit. In other words, you are treating an accountability issue as if it is a means or an ability issue. That's what we mean by the soft mistake. And amazingly, in most corporate organizations, this is actually the mistake that gets done most frequently. It's the soft mistake. And of the two mistakes, the worst mistake is the soft mistake. And the reason why the soft mistake is the worst of the two is that the problem with the soft mistake is, in the first instance, it's the equivalent of leaving the rotten apple in the barrel. If people aren't held accountable, then over a period of time, you get this huge sort of drift of standards. But the second issue is actually lies at the root of what you could call the incremental increase of control, rather than the incremental suspension of control that you should have in an organization. And the reason why that happens is because if you aren't going to hold people accountable, the only other way you can deal with the problem is to actually, of somebody's misbehavior, is to impose, is to try and make sure it never happens again, to impose another control. So let's say, for instance, all of us on this call are, we all work for the same organization that Clint runs. And we're all allowed to use credit cards on company business. We've all been trained how to do it. And I get caught having used my credit card to buy a holiday for myself and my entire extended family, it's a big family, to the Maldives. Shocking. Now, what I've seen people do in corporate environments is that, you know, they kind of scandalize, oh, he abused the credit card. They will send me on a corporate governance course, but then they will take the credit cards away from everybody else. You know, and what's strange about this phenomenon is that it seems to be a virtue. In fact, you can call it the let's not witch hunt syndrome, which basically says when something messes up, don't have a witch hunt, just make sure it never happens again. And you can translate that into English as to say when somebody messes up, don't find out who's accountable, just impose another control. So as a result, because the organizations so frequently make the soft mistake, there's a bias towards an incremental growth of control in organizations over time. This is why organizations become increasingly bureaucratic and increasingly kind of top-heavy as they get older. And this is also why all organizations have to go through this periodic purging of business process re-engineering exercises. So we basically, if we just pan out from what we've been speaking about so far, we said the organization succeeds based on the degree to which the average person in the organization is willing to make an unconditional contribution to the organization. They're willing to make a discretionary contribution, put in more than what they're taking out. It's that willingness which is pixie dust that produces success, that creates a collaborative organization that serves its market. In the first instance, that intent to serve translates into how people deal with each other in peer groups, where members of peer groups aren't there to compete with each other, they're there to set each other up to succeed. You know, that I'm here to make my colleague the star, not to be the star. That horizontal cut. Then we said, but hold on, that's dependent on another cut, the vertical cut, which is really concerned with how hierarchies operate. You know, in other words, the job of the big one for the little one in the hierarchy is carrying growth, is there to give. In other words, you know, it doesn't matter who you are. I mean, you're always occupying a place in one of these two variables. You are occupying a place, you know, in a peer group, and you are occupying a place in a hierarchy. And in both of those instances, we're telling you, you know, come to work to serve everybody else. Come to work to set the other up to succeed, to make your colleagues the stars and to make your subordinates the stars. Now, very justifiably, one can be accused of, I mean, this is just going too far. What do you expect us to be? Mother Teresa? I mean, cut my own throat. Why are you saying this? Well, let's ask ourselves, well, why do people come to work and why do you come to work? I mean, this is another question we very frequently ask people. And what's interesting is that there's also themes that come out of that answer, as an answer to that question, rather. The first theme is really concerned with issues relating to security. It's things like getting paid, you know, keeping a roof over my head, earning a decent living, you know, paying the mortgage and the medical aid and putting the kids through school, you know, issues relating to security. The second theme is really concerned with fulfillment, because it's about things like, you know, having fun at work, learning, being creative, issues relating to fulfillment. The third theme is unfortunately a bit of a competitive one. I mean, it's like building my career, achieving something in my life. It's really about the person saying, I don't want to die a nobody. And I think this is true for all people. I mean, nobody wants to die nobody. We all have this little bit of a competitive urge in us. We want to rise up. We want to, end up higher than where we started off. We want to be more and more significant. And because this thing is fundamentally competitive in character, it is about power. It's about rising up against, with regard to others. The last theme for people coming to work has exactly the opposite sort of feel to it as this power theme, because it's rather about making the world a better place, making a contribution, developing others. This is not competitive in character. It's collaborative in character. So in a sense, it's about harmony. So that's why people work: security, fulfillment, power, and harmony. Now, the problem is that most of us don't understand that you can work for as long as you like and as hard as you like at work. You will not get those four things, because those four things are not the product of endeavor committed to work. They're actually the product of something that happens on the inside. Each one of those things are the product, I beg your pardon, of how your intent operates. Because if you look at the issue of intent, I mean, let's say, for instance, that's me. I mean, that's a very good portrait of me. I think you'd agree. Hey? There's this issue of intent. In any moment that you're in, you can either construct your intent on what you're getting, or you can construct your intent on what you're giving. And this is true moment by moment by moment. Now, there's really significant implications for all four of these variables with regard to where you place your intent. If I base my security on anything that I get from the world, anything that sits over here, like, a salary or some assets or a house. The point is, if I base my sense of security on what I'm getting from the world, how often does the world that you're in give you exactly what you want at that particular point in time? And in fact, it very rarely does. So if I base my security on what I'm getting from the world, I'll always be insecure. Whereas if I ask myself, how often do I have control over the quality of what I'm contributing in the moment that I'm in? The quality of what I'm giving in the moment that I'm in. How often have I got control over that? Well, all the time. In other words, if I base my sense of security on the quality of what I'm giving, I'll always be secure. So the implication to this, folks, is that, clearly you can't own enough assets to feel secure. And I mean, surely this must have occurred to you by now. Surely you must have met really wealthy people in your life who are miserably insecure. There's absolutely no relationship between how much people own and how secure they feel. Actually the asset that most profoundly demonstrates this is a house, because in most cultures today, people seem to have this view that if you pay off the bankers and the title deed to your house is in your own safe, you're secure. Well, that's quite a strange assumption, that. I mean, because if you look at the word security, treat it like a brand. If something makes you secure, what does it promise to do for you? Well, it promises to protect you, like the security industry protects you. Like your house is going to do that. I mean, apart from keeping the rain off your head. Because, what does something do if it promises to protect you? Well, it actually has accepted some sort of custodial responsibility with regard to you, so that when there's a disaster aimed at you, it would intercede. Well, I mean, I just don't think that's true at all. I mean, let's say, for instance, I go home this afternoon. I'm 2 meters away from my front door, and some really mean person, a thug in the neighborhood, has been waiting for me. And as I walk up to the door, he leaps out from behind a bush and he beats me to within an inch of my life. Now, let's assume I own this house. I've paid the bankers and the title deed is in my own safe. I don't think my house is going to rush to my defense. I don't think it's going to throw a brick at the assailant and say, hey, you can't beat him up. He's my human being, that. In other words, there's not a single asset that you own that has ever accepted any kind of custodial responsibility with regard to you. But obviously the opposite is true. I mean, let's assume I come home, and this time I didn't get beaten up. I mean, I walked through the door, and my mate Clinton has decided to pull a prank on me, and he's completely vandalized my house. He's thrown red paint on every carpet. He's put the most obscene graffiti on every wall. He's smashed every piece of glassware. He's poured cement into every piece of plumbing in the house. Clinton has completely trashed my house. Am I likely to be cross? Well, absolutely I'm likely to be cross, So the question to ask is, well, who's there to look after? Is the house there to look after me, or am I there to look after the house? And clearly I'm there to look after the house. While not a single asset that I have has admitted any custodial responsibility with regard to me, I've accepted a custodial responsibility with regard to every one of my assets purely by claiming ownership. In other words, folks, you don't own yourself into being secure. You own yourself into being insecure, because the more things you own, the more things you've got to take care of. The more things you own, the more things the South Africans can take away from you. So don't be naive about this. Don't think that the more things you own, the more secure you are. This just is not true. And a very similar logic is true for the relationship between with regard to the issue of fulfillment. I mean, if I base my sense of happiness and contentment and fulfillment on what I'm getting from the world, because the world really gives me what I want at that particular point in time, I'll be discontented. Whereas if I base my happiness on the quality of my contribution, I'll always be fulfilled. The issue of power. So let's assume you and I are in the same room, and I am a South African. In fact, I come from a very peculiar place, the south of Johannesburg. And that doesn't necessarily say very nice things. And you wear a watch, and I really want your watch. Give me your watch. If you thought I was really serious about your watch, I mean, who could withhold the watch? Surely you can withhold the watch. So who's got power over who? So you've got power over me. So if I want something from you, if I want your watch, I become weak. You have power over me. You have to understand this, folks, that every time you engage somebody else on the basis of what you want from them, you've just handed power over to them because you want something that you have no power over. If I shift my intent in this engagement from what I'm trying to get from you to how I can be helpful to you, I construct my engagement with you and what I'm giving, because you can then no longer withhold the watch, I slip out from underneath your ability to manipulate me and I become powerful. In any situation, your power isn't rooted and based on what you're trying to get, because that's what the others got control over. In other words, you cultivate weakness when you construct your intent on what you want to get. Your power is based on what you can give, because this is the only thing that you've got power over. You've got power over what you give. So your power is rooted in your capacity to give or to lose. And this is absolutely universally true. This is why you cannot manipulate suicide bombers. This is how prices get set in markets. I mean, if you watch a price being set in the market, it's going up, up, up. At some point, it doesn't go further. It gets stuck. Now, when does that happen? When somebody says, I won't pay more. In other words, the person who can lose the transaction defines the transaction. The person who can't lose the transaction is still negotiable. In other words, the transaction will define them. This issue of power is actually a subset of the watch rule. Because let's say I want your watch. Your ability to withhold the watch gives you power over me that makes me manipulable and makes me vulnerable to you. You can potentially harm me. So if I want something from you, your ability to withhold what I want makes me vulnerable. Not only am I vulnerable, but I want you to assume that I do come from the southern suburbs of Johannesburg. We are in the same room, and I look really serious about this watch. Give me the watch. If you thought I was really serious trying to get the watch out of you, you'd probably find me somewhat threatening to you. So while I want the watch from you, your ability to withhold the watch makes you a threat to me. And because I'm trying to get the watch from you, I'm a threat to you. You're dangerous to me, I'm dangerous to you. And when two people are dangerous with regard to each other, you're going to have conflict. If I shift my intent in this interaction from what I'm trying to get from you to how I can be helpful, in the first instance, you can no longer withhold the watch. I slip out from underneath your ability to manipulate me. I become free and safe from you. But not only am I safe from you, but precisely because I'm trying to be helpful to you, you're safe from me. We have harmony. So you have to understand that when we make a call on you being at work to make everybody else, your subordinates, your colleagues, the stars, we're not asking you to cut your own throat. We're not asking you to be Mother Teresa, because the product of doing that is that you become secure, you become fulfilled, you have a sense of power, and you have a sense of harmony with your with others in your life. And who has an interest in that? I mean, surely you have an interest in that. So it suggests that as human beings, we really are supremely kind of accountable. We really are. In the first instance, for what it feels to be in our own skins. You cannot blame anybody else for making you feel insecure and discontented. Those two things are a product of how your intent operates. Own it. Not only that, but not only do you produce what it feels like to be in your skin, you actually produce the world you're occupying, moment by moment. Let's assume I'm going to have 10 interactions with 10 different people today. Only those 10 people. And in each interaction, I want you to assume that I'm an absolutely self-serving swine. I have no interest in anybody else, just myself. So in each engagement, I deal with the other on the basis of what I want. How are those interactions going to end? You know, interaction 1, it's going to end into conflict. Interaction 2, I try and get something out of the person who turns to conflict. Interaction. So I've gone through 10 iterations throughout the day. Each one of them has turned into conflict. When I go to bed that night and I reflect on the world that I'm in, what do you think my comment about my world is going to be? I mean, I'm going to say this is a miserable place. They're all out to get me, and quite correctly so. They are out to get me quite legitimately, you know. Assume, on the other hand, in these 10 interactions, I deal with the other on the basis of how I can set the other up to succeed. How can I make the other the star? You know, engagement by engagement, I do that in 10 iterations throughout each one of them. How does each one finish? Harmony, 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 harmony. 10 interactions all turn into harmony. When I go to bed that night, what do you think my comment about my world is going to be? Well, it's going to be something like, this is the most amazing place that I live in. It's populated by my benefactors and my allies. So you do manufacture the world. You know, it's not the collective that defines the individual. It's the other way around. You actually manufacture the world you occupy transaction by transaction. So you can see then that if you're really trying to kind of crack the code of what it means to be human, you as an individual need to crack this problem of the intent to serve, because that is the core issue. That then translates in what that means for you as a member of a team, of a peer group, because that intent to serve actually produces a sense of collaboration and harmony with the people around you. It also is actually the route that makes you succeed, or that enables you to succeed as a leader, because it is the intent to care for and grow the subordinate. The understanding that the job of the coach is to make the athlete the star, is not to be the star. It's that intent that produces legitimate hierarchy, legitimate power. And when you have this health, both in hierarchy and in peer groups, then clearly it cannot but be that the organization orientates to its market to make a contribution to its market, because each individual is there to give. So the organization then orchestrates. You know, I mean, by definition, when people orchestrate, they're willing to act for something bigger than just how they feel at the time. They act for something bigger than themselves. So as an organization, as Schuitema, we basically do the following. We work in these 4 areas of concern. So we help individuals to achieve a fundamental sense of security and fulfillment in their lives. That's kind of what our personal excellence offering is concerned with. We also look at how that translates into teamwork and producing collaborative teams, both in terms of how individuals handle themselves, but also how you can work with a team to create a collaborative feeling. We've done a significant amount of work of getting leaders to understand their role. What does this thing of care and growth actually mean? And we've also done quite a bit of work around, sewing this all up together in an organizational package that kind of orchestrates, that works. Because there are things that are independent of the other 3 variables that are really concerned with how we think through organization that we need to address. Like, how do we measure in the organization? Like, how do we deal with support functions in the organization? What are the superordinate rules we're going to write to deal with control appropriately in the organization? So there's a number of things relating to organization, which are actually superordinate to these other things that we've spoken about here now. And in all 4 of those content areas, we do the, I beg your pardon, we do the following. We do diagnostic work, we do consulting work, we train people, and we coach. So